So this is the second in a series of 2 sermons on the Sabbath, where I am dialoguing with the 2 sermons that my predecessor preached in 1880 or thereabouts. I have 3 sermons by him. I have these 2, and then one on whether or not we should serve wine with communion. He was on the pro-wine side. Got him fired, actually. But the Sabbath commandment, that's the middle commandment. We call it the hinge. The reason we call it that is because it sits both in the table of the law that has to do with loving your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And it also sits in the table of the law that has to do with loving your neighbor as yourself. It's the hinge. Because if you don't have that Sabbath commandment in the structure of the Torah, of the law, then you really can't love God or neighbor. That's the assumption. Now, some of you may know, in fact, many of you probably know, that there are 2 renditions of the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament. The most common one is Exodus chapter 20. It's the one we usually read, but today I'm going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 5, and they are a little different. Would you listen for the word of God as the Spirit brings it to you? Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as Adonai your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to Adonai your God. You shall not do any work, not you, not your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien who is in your town, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore Adonai your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Hear what the Spirit is saying to our church. So just to keep some of you up to date who weren't here last week, Mr. Crosby had a problem, Reverend Crosby did. Apparently there was a lot of debate and argument in the church over whether or not you could do various things on Sunday, the Sabbath day, in order to keep it holy, and he was asked to preach 2 sermons on the subject. And let me give you just a sense as to kind of thing he dealt with. For example, he says, I am often asked such questions as these. Is it right to go walking for pleasure and exercise on Sunday after the church service is over? And if it is, then is there any harm in taking along your lunch in your pocket and eating it in the woods? And if that's all right for one person to do, then why not a dozen or 20 do it and so have a Sunday picnic? Or for that matter, if we may walk on Sunday afternoon, may we not also jump and run? And then surely there's no sin in holding a bat or a racket in one's hand. And so you have baseball and lawn tennis and also other games and amusements on Sunday. And well, some good people are greatly puzzled by this sort of argument and want to know where you are going to draw the line. Now, I do not want to draw any lines, nor do I want to make any artificial rules for myself or for other people, but I do insist upon the validity of the principles that I have stated. His principles were that it's a religious day and a day of rest. That's a pretty tough sell, I think. Pretty tough sell to the people around him, a really tough sell, I think, in our day and culture. And this worried Crosby a little bit. He says that while I do not advocate any straight-laced, narrow, or somber view of our duty, I would all the more earnestly beseech you, everyone who cares for Christ and Christ's cause, to avoid all conduct on the Sabbath day, which either in its own nature or by reason of its associations or owing to the circumstances connected with it. Can you believe people listen to this? Would be likely to secularize the day and make it common, and especially here in California. Is it important that we should do our utmost to protect and preserve our Christian Sabbath? Indeed, Christian people will be obliged to take a more decided stand in this matter if the church and the institutions of religion are not to be swept away by the increasing tide of worldliness. A reasonable worry. Now that the last 126 years have gone by, a reasonable worry, the increasing tide of worldliness. It is something we deal with, but really, who cares? And so we discussed last week why it would be important at all to keep the Sabbath day. I mean, is it just because the commandment's there that says you got to do it and therefore we ought to do it? Well, that seems kind of backwards. You know, it seems more like the commandment is there because there's something about the nature of creation that makes it important for us to take such a day. And then Crosby really leaned very heavily on the reason for keeping the Sabbath day is because the Christian church needed it in order to do its good work in the world. That too seems a little backwards to me, but the real reason he got to was because the day was sanctified, made holy, betrothed even, sanctified by God alone. It's as though eternity itself uttered a day. And when we keep that day, when we push the trappings of creation aside, we find ourselves in the presence of God, formed by the presence of God. That's what the first table of the law is all about. We set ourselves in context. We set ourselves touched by the Spirit, formed by the Spirit, and it allows the love to overflow us that we may be just and righteous and good and kind to the people around us. That's why we keep the Sabbath day, because eternity meets us. Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish scholar, his daughter said he said that the Sabbath was a caress that comes to you and wipes away all fear and somber thoughts, all the stresses and strains of the world. That Sabbath comes and wipes it all away if we keep the Sabbath. Go through the effort to push creation aside. Good reason to do it, especially in a fractured world. But unrealistic. But really, when we think about how fractured our world, the anxiety that people have, when we think about the loneliness that comes as we fight against one another, as neighbor fights against neighbor over what kind of color their fence is going to be, as we feel that kind of isolation and loneliness that comes because of a kind of class warfare or even an ethnic warfare, do we need a Sabbath? Do we need a caress that will come and wipe away all of the fears and all of those heavy, somber thoughts? Unrealistic, but don't we need it? The competition in this world's incredible. Barbara and I are taking our son Matthew to the University of Colorado tomorrow. And I'm really looking forward to it. But you know why we're not taking him to Santa Barbara? Well, because, he didn't have a 3.8 average. You know what the average kid in Berkeley got? 4.2. I mean, we have so much competition in the world, they had to make up a new grade since I was a kid. More and more competition. So much competition, I am told, that in order to find a kennel in New York City for your dog to be able to go to when you're on vacation, you have to be able to fill out a form and have them go in for 3 hours of playtime before they can be accepted. One wonders, unrealistic though it may be, if we don't need the touch of the Sabbath, for the Sabbath to come to us, for eternity to break into our lives and hold a piece of creation so that we can be formed, we can be touched, we can be made whole. That's what Sabbath's for. But it's unrealistic. Why? Could it be that we are bound up enslaved maybe to the kind of pace of change and the movement of the creation that's all around us? We can't slow down because we live in a culture that is going the speed of light. It seems unrealistic and sometimes even foolish because to do so would make us truly odd. We are enslaved to these things, which is kind of Deuteronomy's point. You know, Exodus, when it talks about this commandment, it says, we keep the Sabbath day because God made creation in 6 days and rested on the seventh, sanctified that day, eternity, uttered a day that we might be brought into it. But not so in Deuteronomy. Did you hear it? In Deuteronomy, what was our reason? Our reason was that you were to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that Adonai your God brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And therefore, Adonai your God commands you to keep the Sabbath. It's your male and your female slave that need to rest as well as you. Deuteronomy takes a turn. The Exodus commandment opens our hearts and our eyes to and imagination to the possibility that eternity is reaching into our lives, touching us and changing us. But Deuteronomy takes a turn to the second table of the law. This becomes about loving your neighbor, about being formed in such a way that we love our neighbor. Why are we enslaved to our culture? Because we have not taken the time to rest and to realize that we are free in the presence of God. We are, the strangers within our gate are, and with that rest, with that recognition, with that remembering that we are God's people and are freed in God's creation, do we not look at the world in a different way? One wonders whether or not we might develop some moral imagination and bring more justice into the world around us. You could pick almost anything, but how about we pick the immigrants that live in our city right now? It's their city too. How about them? Might we have some moral imagination that allows people to rest, that allows those people too to feel as though they are in the presence of God? Many of you know Hector. Hector's a first-rate guy. He's been here as long as I've been here. I think he's been here 10 years. Cleaning the church, setting things up, always there for people. You know, if you need somebody to help you do yard work around your house, Hector's there for you. You know, Hector works 3 jobs. When he was 16 years old, his father gave him little money and said, take off, get out of here, go to America. Why would a man do that? Because Hector's 2 older brothers had been recruited into militias. So this 16-year-old boy came and he has worked, and he has worked, and he has worked. Are we letting the resident alien within our gates have that moment of rest? Have we taken enough of a rest ourselves to open our hearts and allow our imaginations to realize how it is that God reaches into our lives? Heard a story this week, a guy named Esvin Garcia. Just going to read it to you. It says, my name is Esvin Garcia, and I'm a member at San Rafael Church Choir. And after finishing choir practice late one evening last month, I got into my car and I forgot to turn on my headlights before leaving the church parking lot. As soon as I came out on 5th Street, it's right down there, I noticed my lights were off and I turned them on. How many times has that happened to you? I then realized that a police officer was following me, and 2 blocks later he pulled me over. The officer told me that he had not stopped me for any violation, but to talk to me about not turning on my lights in time. He asked me for my driver's license, and I told him I didn't have one. I showed him my Guatemalan consular identification and asked him to give me the chance to call someone with a license that could pick me up and drive my car, but the officer refused. As a result, my car was impounded for 30 days. I received a violation for driving without a license. The cost of the ticket, the police department fee, and fee to the towing company to take my car out made a total of $2,640. I've been sad and upset since this happened. I work hard in a job that pays modestly, and though I can barely earn enough to support my family, I had to borrow money to get my car back. It is my responsibility to pay for driving without a license. However, is it right, is it fair to have to pay for a 30-day car impoundment when I didn't even commit a violation? We live in an ethos of fear. We figure we can make laws to fix problems. But do we rest enough to realize that we are free in the presence of God? Can that relationship with eternity as it breaks into our lives allow our hearts and imaginations to be changed so that the love of God can overflow us and we can love one another? That's what the commandment's about. A day of rest. Unrealistic, though, right? It's unrealistic. To engage in Sabbath rest would most certainly be countercultural. We couldn't possibly do it alone. I'm not even sure that a church community could do it all by itself. But nevertheless, it is the good news. In a world where there is isolation and division and injustice, it is good news, this Sabbath commandment, that comes to us as a hinge. Eternity utters a day and allows us to live in the presence of God. And because of that, we are able to develop imagination, eyes of hope, as we go on from that place and do our work together.